There's a similar debate that string teachers get into with string crossings as the debate with vibrato. Which type of vibrato should we teach? Arm vibrato, wrist vibrato, finger vibrato. But ultimately, if you've seen my episode on vibrato, you need all three different types of vibrato, except if you're a bass player, you need all three different types of vibrato to be a complete player. So there's the same debate among string teachers with string crossing. Should the elbow lead the dance or should the wrist lead the dance? Which one should lead first? And you can plead your case for which technique is superior, leading with the elbow or leading with the wrist, but you're both right. And you're also both wrong. Because to be a complete player, you need to be able to do both. So to determine which type of string crossing technique that we should use in a passage, we need to ask some questions about the music that we're playing. First of all, which part of the bow are we playing in? Are we playing closer to the frog? Are we playing at the balance point, the middle, the upper half of the bow? That makes a big difference because the further you are from the frog, the more you have to move in order to cross strings. So if you're trying to cross strings with the wrist and you're playing at the tip, it's going to be much more difficult than you are crossing strings at the frog or the balance point area. You also need to think about the sound that you're trying to generate and the articulation that you're trying to get. There's this give and take, a compromise, if you will, on the strength of the articulation versus the smoothness or the connection in between notes. So of course, when we use our wrist, we're going to get a more smooth connection, more legato, and when we use our elbow, we're going to get harder articulations and more defined beginnings to the notes. We also have to think about the type of bow motion that we're using, the length of the bow, and what that's going to look like. And I like to look at these in shapes. You know, are we making a wave? Are we making a U? Are we making an ellipse? Like, what are we doing with our arms? Like, what shape are we drawing? To relate this to my students, I get them to think about sparklers, you know, like the 4th of July or New Year's Eve. You light up a sparkler and you draw your name. Well, we kind of draw shapes with our bows. They're not on fire, hopefully, but we're drawing shapes with our bows. If we had a sparkler in our hand instead of a bow, what would we be drawing? And the bigger the shapes that we're drawing, the more the elbow should lead, and the smaller the shapes, the more the wrist should lead. We also got to think about tempo and speed. You know, how fast are the rhythmic values and how fast are the tempos? The wrist is going to be able to move much quicker than the elbow because the elbow has to move a greater distance than the wrist. We also have to consider the bowing. Is it slurred? Is it détaché? Are we moving from string to string? Or are we playing on one string and then crossing to a different string and staying on that one for a while? So there's lots of different things to consider there. We also have to consider how many strings that we're going across. You know, like there's a lot of passages in Vivaldi where we have to, in the violin part, where we have to go from the E string to the G string for a note and then pop back up on the E string to play. And that's very difficult to do just with the wrist. So in that case, the elbow would lead the dance. But then in another example, like in Kreutzer number 13, you know, if we're trying to do all of that with the elbow, it's like we're a bird trying to take off, you know, that's had its wings clipped, you know, and we're just staying, you know, we're just trying to flap our way off the ground, and that's not going to work as well as using the wrist. So in both instances of wrist-led string crossing and elbow-led string crossing, both joints are still functioning. It's just which one is leading the other. If we're using the wrist technique, the elbow still has to be in position. And so we have to ask, well, what position should the elbow be in? And the best way to find that is to find the best elbow position to where you're playing a double stop on the string that you're playing on and the string that you're crossing to. And that's sort of the neutral position. And then your wrist does the rest. And when the elbow's leading and the wrist is following, you still have to move the wrist. The wrist isn't completely locked, or else you're going to get some horrible sounding string crossings. Okay, so the wrist has to still move. It's not one or the other, it's both. You just have to figure out which one is moving first. So instead of debating like which technique we should teach or which technique we should use, let's look at the music instead and look at the passage that we're about to play and decide which technique works best for that passage at that particular time. Now, one of my demonstration videos for this episode, and I'm going to talk about this later on when I talk about troubleshooting and accountability, is to develop coordination. We often slow passages down and work on them very slowly until we can get everything perfect, and then gradually build up the speed while maintaining that perfect technique and that sound that we want, in order to progress, rather than trying to play it fast and sloppy all the time and just trying to correct as we go along that way. It's not as efficient. There's that trope, if you want to learn how to play faster, play slower, and that's absolutely correct. However, when we're talking about the technique that we're using for string crossing, this can get us into very big trouble, because if we're playing slower and we're using elbow-led string crossing technique, it might not work as we get to a certain tempo range. We might max out at a certain tempo range, and then we just can't break into, the 130 beats per minute, 140 beats per minute, whatever it is. Like, we just hit a wall that we can't seem to come through. And a lot of times it's because when we were practicing at that tempo, we were using a technique that works for a slower passage, but that technique does not work as well when we start playing faster. So when we're woodshedding, we're practicing with the metronome in a slow tempo, we need to use the same technique, the same amount of bow that we're going to use at the faster tempo, which usually means shorter bows and more wrist. In any case, should the wrist lead when you're crossing strings? Yes. Should the elbow lead when you're crossing strings? Also, yes. And the same nose for both questions too. It just depends on the music that you're playing. So teach your students both techniques and teach them which technique is most appropriate.